Right now, I'm supervising 15 master's students doing literature reviews, and in my recent meetings with them, several are on track to lose significant marks from the same avoidable mistakes. These aren't obscure problems, they come up constantly, even at the PhD level. In this video, we'll discuss what these 8 mistakes are and how you can prevent them. These tips will save you for a great deal of headache later and potentially save you from failing your submissions. We'll look at the mistakes systematically and follow the lifespan of the generic literature review. While I'm describing literature review generally, I will be making references to mistakes in scoping reviews, systematic reviews, and narrative reviews, as they quite often apply across the board. We will begin with the design and conception of the literature review, then the research objectives, then the search, the analysis, and finally making conclusions within the literature review itself. Literature reviews are generally quite structured, with guidance from JBI, Cochrane, PRISMA, etc. But that also means that mistakes made early on in the research process can have an impact on the steps later. Some mistakes are not apparent until you write up your review. This is why it is so important to get these ironed out as early as you can. The first mistake is probably the most common one, and it happens before students even begin the review itself. A lot of students assume literature reviews are easier than primary research because I don't need participants, I don't need ethical approvals, I don't need data collection. So they assume that the dissertation will be a lot simpler. However, literature reviews are extremely demanding research projects. Instead of generating data, you are synthesizing existing evidence, identifying patterns, evaluating contradictions, and building an analytical argument from dozens or even hundreds of papers. Most importantly, in empirical research, you may only need to understand one research method very well. In literature reviews, you often need to understand a broad range of research methods in order to interpret and synthesize the studies properly. This is where many students struggle. Treat literature reviews as real research projects from day one. You'll still need a rigorous methodology, clear objectives, transparent processes, systematic analysis, and justified conclusions. And importantly, reading papers is not the same as conducting a literature review. A literature review is a research method. If you want to understand why some so-called easy research methods are actually not easy at all, I have another video linked above. The second mistake is beginning a literature review without checking whether a review has already been done. Now, this is particularly important for systematic reviews and scoping reviews. Students sometimes become very excited about a topic and immediately begin searching for papers without first asking, has somebody already conducted this review? Now, this may sound very obvious, but this happens surprisingly often. You might spend weeks screening articles only to discover that a very similar review was already published last year in a major journal. At that point, your contribution becomes a lot weaker. And in some cases, your supervisor may even tell you to redesign the entire project, or at the marking stage, you will be heavily penalized for something that you should have checked at the start of your research planning. So before you commit to a review topic, you need to conduct a preliminary exploratory search. You are not yet searching for all of the evidence, you are searching for existing reviews. Search the database properly. Look at the systematic reviews, scoping reviews, umbrella reviews, meta-analyses, and narrative reviews in the topic area. In fact, this is where you should start with any research idea because they've already synthesized the available research on your topic, which is exactly what you need at this very early point of the research idea development. And when you find existing reviews, don't immediately abandon your idea. Ask yourself, are the reviews outdated? Did they focus on different populations? Did they use different methods? Were there any limitations that your review can address? Is there a geographical gap? Is there a theoretical gap? Is there a practice gap that you can explore? Sometimes the contribution is not doing something completely new, but doing something better, more updated, more focused. I have a research gap finder that I covered in a previous video that helps you find viable research gaps for you in your research topic based off the preliminary exploratory searches. The video is over here. Mistake 3, choosing the wrong literature review method. This is another extremely common problem. Students often choose a review method because they heard their friends doing it rather than because it actually fits their research objectives. For example, some students automatically choose systematic reviews because they sound more scientific or rank highly on the hierarchy of evidence. But every review method is designed for a different purpose. The same applies to scoping reviews and narrative reviews. And if you choose the wrong review method, your objective objectives may become impossible to achieve, which then affects the quality of your conclusions later. The review method must align with the research objectives. So before choosing the review type, ask yourself, what exactly am I trying to achieve, and can this review method realistically achieve that? Once your research objectives become clearer, the appropriate review method usually becomes easier to identify. The problem is that many students only know of one or two review methods, so they apply it everywhere. But you need to understand what different review methods are for, what they can do, and what they cannot do before making that decision. Don't jump into applying a research method before understanding why you're applying it, and also the range of review methods that are available to you. Mistake 4, having a search strategy that cannot be replicated. One of the defining characteristics of strong literature reviews, especially systematic and scoping reviews, is transparency. Another researcher should theoretically be able to follow your processes and understand how you've arrived at your final set of papers. As a marker, this is how I test this. I will copy and paste the student's declared search string and see if I can get the same numbers as they do, or at least close to that. If a search string fails this test, then the later stages don't really matter. Especially for scoping reviews and systematic reviews, the review stages are sequential, they're not iterative. Problems that happen early on cascade down the entire review process. This is where your PRISMA flowchart falls apart and you violate PRISMA principles like transparency and replicability and the PRISMA statement. From the marker's perspective, I cannot test your screening, nor can I test your data extraction without actually conducting your whole review. However, I can very easily copy and paste your search string onto a database and hit search. This is why documenting your search strategy carefully is absolutely essential. And this documentation, it should happen while you're searching, not weeks later or months later when you're trying to remember what you did while writing up the entire paper. Keep records of your database's search, the exact search string, screening decisions, inclusion and exclusion criteria, dates of searches, and the number of papers at each stage. And when you report, make sure you do your backward testing of the search strategy that you're declaring by running the search strings again. I won't fail a student purely because of this, but it can potentially affect my decision if I am considering whether or not this submission is a 60+% submission or a 50+% level submission. In the above video, I've created a literature search tracker that you can download for free to solve this problem, because guess what? I myself have been guilty of this. Mistake number 5, underestimating the time required for searching and screening. One of the fastest ways students can derail a literature review is by massively underestimating how long searching and screening actually takes. Students often imagine that the review is mostly about reading and writing. In reality, huge amounts of time are spent before analysis even begins. Developing a proper search string alone can take many days. Then you still need to refine it and adapt it for different databases. And screening, that can take even longer, especially if you retrieve hundreds or thousands of papers. You may need to remove duplicates, screen title and abstracts, retrieve full text, screen full text, repeatedly apply eligibility criteria, and revisit your earlier decisions as well. Some of these stages are extremely repetitive and time-consuming. So what can you do? Build far more time into your planning than you think you need, especially for screening, reading, organizing, note-taking, and most importantly, thinking. And if this is your first review, expect the process to be even slower. Students often end up redoing searches or refining eligibility criteria once they realize that their original approach was too broad or too vague, and that is all very normal. So make sure you're prepared for all of these potential delays. Mistake number 6, extracting too little information from the papers. This mistake creates major problem later during analysis. Students often extract very superficial information from the studies, and then when they begin writing, they realize that they don't have enough detail to compare the papers properly. Or worse, their synthesis becomes oversimplified because important nuances were never extracted in the first place. At the point of data extraction, especially when you are new to literature reviews, you should extract more data than you would need. For example, extracting more details on intervention and its processes. Don't just list the outcome measure or write down funding as a barrier. Explain and describe, because you might need this later when you write up. Students often make this mistake because they learn from published reviews and confuse the final summary tables that are published with the actual extraction processes. Those summary tables are the cleaned up end product. of the review. They're not the raw extraction itself. Data extraction is supposed to reduce and organize information for synthesis later. If you extract too little information, you end up either making sweeping assumptions about papers or constantly going back to the original studies later, which then defeats the purpose of the extraction stage entirely. Mistake number 7, analysis that is too superficial or goes beyond the method. This is probably one of the biggest academic weaknesses I see in postgraduate literature reviews. Students that do poorly tend to present their reviews either too much like a summary or make conclusions that are too sweeping or go too far beyond what their research methods can do. I often see students present their narrative reviews as merely summaries of the reviewed papers like this. Author A said this, author B said this, author C said this. Well, if I wanted summaries of individual papers, then I could have just read their abstracts myself. Depending on the type of literature review you're doing, a strong literature review should identify patterns, trends, contradictions, debates, methodological weaknesses, theoretical tensions, research gaps, so on and so forth. You are trying to construct an analytical discussion across the literature, not merely reporting individual studies one by one. But there is another problem here as well. Some students go too far beyond what their review method can actually support. For example, they make causal claims or policy recommendations or conclusions on effectiveness of interventions that are not justified by the evidence base they're reviewing. Or they may overgeneralize the findings from weak or heterogeneous studies. Your conclusions must remain proportionate to the strength of the evidence and the scope of the review and the limitations of the review. This then goes back to my earlier point about choosing the right literature review method. The final mistake is something that I see particularly in applied disciplines. I teach within healthcare professional education, so I see a lot of students doing literature reviews to improve clinical practice or teaching of other healthcare professionals. The problem is that students often confuse the research that they review and think that research is a reflection of real-world clinical practice. Students will make conclusions like XYZ is a popular method of executing this intervention, or there is a recent rise in this particular intervention being used. Research is not the same as practice. Research often captures a degree of novelty, and that gives it its contribution to knowledge, and practice, on the other hand, is very resistant to change due to real-world constraints like money, familiar workflows, etc. What you see in research is often not or not yet in practice. Conversely, what is in practice is not always in line with research. Again, this is an important thing to take note at the start of your research idea development. Just because something is popular in practice doesn't mean that there is enough research about it. For example, I had a student who wanted to do a piece of research in electron microscopy for diagnosing a specific condition. The student argued that the electron microscope is commonly used for this purpose, and it's important to understand technical development. On the surface, all of this sounds cogent, but when I popped my head into the literature, there actually hasn't been much development in this research idea, and there has been only about 2 papers published on this in the last 25 years. You need to be very careful when you're making your conclusions. Quite often, you can only make conclusions about what is in the research literature rather than make broad sweeping claims about what is in practice. Often, what is currently in practice requires empirical research to determine, not a review. There are so many ways to lose marks in research, and many of these are out of your hands. This is why it's so important to ensure that you are not losing marks in areas where you could have prevented. I'm Dr. Kenny Wong. I teach research at 2 UK universities, and I consult with master's and PhD students on their dissertations and research projects. If you want to work with me directly, the website is in the description below, and the free resources that I mentioned, like the Research Gap Finder, the Literature Review Search Tracker, all of them are linked below as well. If you want to make sure that you don't miss any of my videos about academic tools and tips for postgraduate research students, make sure you are subscribed. You will also find my previous video on research proposal mistakes really helpful too. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye!